As winter turns inexorably to spring, the perpetual arrival of the golf season at Dollymount is heralded by the first stroke medal competition for members. This furtive post-winter foray back to card and pencil is distinguished from the other 7 medal competitions by the fact that it is named in memory of a particular golfer. That golfer is Thomas McIntosh Gilroy. Prior to jumping down this particular rabbit hole, I had some knowledge of Mr. Gilroy. It's safe to say that after a few additional weeks of research, I now have a good deal more. So without any further delay, we will initially pick up the Gilroy family story in the 1830s. As a confluence of empire and industry present a Dundee-based family with ever-increasing opportunities derived from a substance known as jute. Much like hemp and flax, jute is an organic fibre made from the inner bark of trees commonly found in India and Bangladesh. It was used to make burlap, hessian and gunny cloth. Interestingly, jute production was closely associated with whaling, commonplace among coastal communities of Scotland during the 1800s. Some intrepid souls discovered that when raw jute was treated with whale oil, it enabled workers to spin the fibre into fabric. Dundee's whaling fleet provided a ready supply of oil, and the subcontinent had no lack of raw product for productive purposes. Thomas Gilroy's father, Robert, founded Gilroy Brothers and Company in 1846. Over the next 15 years, Robert expanded the Tay Bridge Works into one of Britain's largest textile mills, employing nearly 3,000 people. By the 1860s, the Gilroys had disintermediated the London-centric jute supply chain. They would import their precious cargo directly from Calcutta. Jute would come from their own plantations, which was then baled and pressed in company-owned processing plants, before being shipped directly to Dundee using their own fleet of sailing ships. The city quickly became the worldwide production centre for jute, and as a result was often referred to as Juteopolis. Demand for the substance was driven by the growing military requirement for strong, coarse cloths for tents, sandbags, sailcloth, tarpaulin and rope. War in Crimea, America and between France and Prussia drove the demand to unprecedented levels. Over a 30-year period from the mid-1850s, jute importation to Dundee rose from an initial 30,000 tonnes to over 200,000 tonnes in the 1880s. Now I hear you say that's all quite interesting, but can we get on to the golf? And yes, of course we can. However, this backstory is instructive in understanding the position of relative advantage afforded to Thomas Gilroy upon his birth in Dundee in October 1852. It will come as no surprise that the wider Gilroy family had all prospered as a result of the growing success of the family business, and they would find like-minded souls amongst the memberships of the Montefieth, Dalhousie and Panmure golf clubs, which they overlooked from the relative tranquillity of the Broughty Ferry suburb of Dundee, where they all had built palatial accommodations. A deep dive into the record books of the aforementioned clubs returns a litany of competitive Gilroy successes for Tom and many of his relatives, 3 of whom were also members of the Royal and Ancient Club of St Andrews. Membership of this august institution would be bestowed upon Tom in 1887. It is interesting to note that the Montefieth Club Championship has been competed for since 1883. The winner is presented with the Gilroy Trophy, donated to the club by Tom himself. Thomas Gilroy was educated at Madras College in St Andrews, and between his lessons in Latin, algebra and ornamental penmanship, young Master Tom was often to be found wandering the links at Carnoustie, cleek in hand, whacking his ball expertly from one side of the Barryburn to the other. These initial carefree steps were negotiated under the tutelage of George Morris, the keeper of the greens at Carnoustie at the time. Gilroy would subsequently perfect his game under the guidance of a grand triumvirate. Instruction came courtesy of old Tom Morris, and also his preferred foursomes partner, the three-time British Open champion Jamie Anderson. He was also known to play regularly with young Tommy Morris before his untimely passing in 1875. A measure of young Gilroy's ability and his connection to the Morris family can be gauged by referencing a 1908 Golf Illustrated article by Harry B. Wood, who explains that a short spoon made specially by Tom Morris in 1866 from Mr. Thomas Gilroy, playing at Carnoustie in a competition for a 20-guinea cup, and having the misfortune to break his driver, the owner of the short spoon drove it for the last 9 holes, which he holed out in 36 strokes, and was enabled to annex the valuable prize. Census returns from Dundee in 1871 list Tom's occupation as merchant. How much merchanting he was doing is unknown. However, it appears a sufficient amount, enabling him to marry Isabella in late 1873 and to complete the building of a grand house called Teen Dune in Montefieth, on a site with commanding views to the west, south and east, given its prominent position overlooking the Tay estuary. Through these times, Tom would play significant amounts of elite golf throughout Angus, Fife and farther afield. A serial winner, however, it being Scotland, no handicap information for him becomes available until after he starts his travels en famille a few years later. He would also captain the Montefieth Golf Club in 1874 as a fresh-faced 22-year-old. On the home front, Isabella and Tom were blessed with 2 sons and 2 daughters. Unsurprisingly, all of the Gilroy progeny would go on to have lives in golf, but more of that anon. A move south to the Cheltenham area of Gloucestershire was undertaken at some point in early 1883. The Gilroy's Teen Dune residence was sold by public auction during 1883. The property came with a pre-auction guide price of £4,500. This sum approximates to roughly £700,000 in today's money. The Gilroys would move to Mayville, a grand house located on the private Battledown estate development on the outskirts of Cheltenham. From a golfing perspective, press reports of the time suggest that Gilroy and his friend, Major Warren Swettenham, were anxious to form a golf club of their own in the greater Cheltenham area. However, despite their best efforts to engender interest, there did not seem to be any great appetite amongst the locals for such a scheme. They would make do by travelling the 20 miles from Cheltenham to Malvern twice a week to play golf on Malvern Common, on the green of the Worcestershire Golf Club. Incidentally, a young Harry Shapton colt would subsequently learn the game of golf on that very same common, prior to heading on to the bright lights of Clare College, Cambridge. As soon as Mr. Gilroy begins competing in England, we first see his handicap reported as scratch. Over the course of the next few years, Gilroy would sweep all comers across the Malvern links. He would also hold the captaincy of the club during 1884 and 1885. In 1885, he competed at Hoylake in the inaugural staging of what would soon become the Amateur Championship, losing to the eventual winner A.F. McPhee in the quarterfinals. Gilroy competed in the Amateur Championship on 6 additional occasions. Unfortunately for him, he drew the great John Ball Jr. at the quarterfinal stage in both 1886 and 1887, leading to defeats that were probably of little surprise, given the legendary status of Mr. Ball's abilities. Gilroy's final amateur championship came at St Andrews in 1891, yielding him a bronze medal as a beaten semi-finalist at the stymied hands of the 1889 champion Johnny Laidlaw of the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. Laidlaw would go on to lose in the final to Harold Hilton. Towards the end of 1885, Thomas Gilroy retired to the Irish countryside, taking residence at Coney Hall in Mornington on the southern banks of the River Boyne in County Meath. Coney Hall abutted what was at the time known as the Burrows. The house is no longer in existence, however its former site is located on the northern end of what is now the Laytown and Bettystown golf links. Back in 1885, there wasn't too much formal golf on offer in Ireland, save for a military course at the Curragh Camp Garrison and Training Camp in County Kildare, another course at Kinnegher on the banks of Belfast Lough, played over by the Belfast Golf Club from 1881. Finally, the Jemison family, true to their Scottish heritage, had a private course around their St Marnock's House property on the Jemison estate in Portmarnock. Earlier that year, a meeting had been convened at the premises of the Provincial Bank on College Green. This meeting had been arranged by the bank manager himself, another Scotsman by the name of John Lumsden, with the purpose of concerting measures for the establishment of a Dublin golf club. Permission was subsequently sought and granted by the Secretary of the Board of Public Works to lay out a course beside the magazine fort, upon the only land suitable for golf in the district. Unsurprisingly, given the lack of any formal golf in the Meath area, Thomas Gilroy gravitated towards the newly formed club in the Phoenix Park for his membership and golfing needs. The first recorded golfing action in Ireland for Gilroy is in the act of representing his new Dublin club in a match against Belfast on the 24th of October 1885 across the new green adjacent to the magazine fort in the Phoenix Park. This match is recognised as the very first interclub golf match to be held on the island of Ireland, with the fixture still played annually, rotating on a home and away basis, facilitating long-lasting friendships and conviviality in equal measure over the past 140 years. On the day in question, Gilroy was pitted against Belfast's best golfer, George Bailey, a fellow Scot from Musselburgh. By the end of the match, Gilroy had won 8 holes, with the Dublin club also prevailing by 12 holes on aggregate. Incidentally, George Bailey was a central figure in founding not only the Belfast Golf Club, but also the new clubs soon to be formed at Portrush and Newcastle in 1888 and 1889 respectively. The Belfast club were afforded an early opportunity of retrieving their fortunes the following year. This rematch at a neutral venue would mark the opening of a new 11-hole golf course that had been laid out along the southern banks of the River Boyne by Tom Gilroy himself. He had secured permission from the local landowner Owen Reynolds to lay out a links that, according to the Belfast newsletter, was delightfully situated at the mouth of the Boyne, abounding with legitimate hazards: the bunker, the rabbit scrape, the water, the furze. Here is not only opportunity for the long driver and the stealthy putter, but for the successful player of the sand iron and niblick too. The 26 golfers in attendance on the day made 2 loops of the 11-hole golf course. This time, Tom Gilroy would trounce George Bailey 14 holes to 2, with the Dublin team once again winning the contest by an aggregate score of 121 holes to 110. Relations between Bailey and Gilroy can't have been too frosty, as it appears they took a little road trip northwards at the start of 1888. Royal Portrush's official handbook of 1930 recounts that early in the year of 1888, 2 Scottish-born golf enthusiasts, George Bailey and Tom Gilroy, visited Portrush. They were struck with the evident adaptability of the sandy hills and dunes in the vicinity of the little railway station as a golf course. Several members of leading families interested themselves in the project, and before long, suitable land was obtained from Lord Antrim and a 9-hole course was started. George Bailey would be elected as the honorary secretary of the club's first meeting, with the course scheduled to open on Saturday the 12th of May 1888. While in Ireland, Tom Gilroy would spend significant time at Portrush, where the family had a second house, allowing them an opportunity to enjoy the bracing north coast air in consort with some capital seaside golf. Not only had Gilroy been instrumental in originally selecting the site, it is also clear that as he began to spend more time in Portrush, he would assume responsibility for course improvements in conjunction with a number of members, such as Dr. Roberts Law, George Bailey, and others. The club would bestow honorary membership to Tom at its AGM in 1896 in recognition of these efforts. Remembering that Mr. Gilroy was in essence a professional gentleman who appears to have had plenty of time in his hands, he was of course also keeping his eye back in Dublin. By 1888 he was captain of the Dublin Club, and in consultation with other members of the Brains Trust, they had accepted the limitations of the Phoenix Park site for golf and had begun to investigate alternatives. A short sojourn to Cush Point in Sutton was undertaken in late 1888. However, by the early months of 1889, the Dublin Golf Club had negotiated permission to move to a new home at Dollymount, located on the North Bull Island. Having already designed his own course at Mornington, and indeed been involved in the ongoing improvements of golf at Portrush, Tom Gilroy would lay out the first course at Dollymount, with assistance from John Lumsden Sr. and Thomas Leonard, the keeper of the greens. The first competition was held over the newly laid links on St. Patrick's Weekend 1889. Fittingly, it was won by Tom Gilroy with a score of 79 shots playing off scratch. By the same weekend in 1890, the Gilroys would be celebrating the inauguration of the County Meath Golf Club, which needless to say would call Tom Gilroy's Mornington Links creation home. The course had, at this stage, been extended to 14 holes, and the club was the proud home to 20 members from the locality. Tom once again wins the opening competition with a score of 121 off the stick for 2 laps of the course. What happens next is somewhat shrouded in mystery. Suffice to say, there appears to have been a disagreement with Owen Reynolds over whose land the course had been laid upon and played over ever since 1886. By all available accounts, Mr. Reynolds seemed to possess a pretty combustible temperament and a somewhat litigious compulsion, if the numerous lawsuits that he took against friend and foe in the greater locale are anything to go by. Whatever transpired, the Mornington course would be abandoned and the golf club disbanded. Plan B was initiated. Better land on the other side of the River Boyne at Baltray was secured under lease, and Gilroy and George Pentland would lay out 9 holes initially, which would be extended to 18 in 1894. Back in early 1889, when the Dublin Golf Club had been mulling over their search for new accommodations, committee member John Petrie suggested that perhaps the club should engage the services of old Tom Morris to lay out the proposed new links at Dollymount. The committee, in their wisdom, decided against such an arrangement and left it up to Mr. Gilroy to work his magic. Old Tom did indeed visit Ireland on a number of occasions in the 1880s and 1890s, extending the original links at Newcastle in 1889 and laying out the original courses at both Rosapenna in 1893 and Lahinch in 1894. On his return from laying out Lahinch, Mr. Morris graced the links at Dollymount over the course of 2 days. In a throwback to days past, Tom Gilroy would pair up with his former instructor in playing a 36-hole match against Mr. Petrie and the club professional Anthony Brown. Gilroy and Morris would win the 36-hole match by 1 hole. During his time in Ireland, Tom Gilroy would travel the length and breadth of the country, setting course records wherever he went. So much so that in those early days, The standard scratch score was directly derived from the scores that he posted. Circumstances seemed to change during the year of 1895, and by year's end, Thomas Gilroy would be bound for the south coast of England on a permanent basis. However, one final golfing circuit was undertaken. Gilroy appeared to be a man on a mission, setting a new course record of 74 strokes at County Louth, winning his final medal competition at Dollymount, and finally competing in what would be his last Irish Amateur Championship at Portrush. Unfortunately, he would succumb to J.S. Reid of Portrush by 4-2 in the second round. At least all was not in vain, for young Randall, his 20-year-old son, would beat the great John Ball in the very same round. He would progress to the semi-final before W. Taylor of Edinburgh ensured that history repeated itself, for it was at this very same stage in the inaugural holding of the Irish Championship at Portrush in 1892 that his father had been beaten by J.H. Andrew of Prestwick. Prior to his departure to England, a contemporary is quoted as follows: "He has done much for the Royal and Ancient Game in Ireland during the last 10 years. His advice has been continually sought whenever new greens were projected, and it was always unstintedly and ungrudgingly given. As to giving hints to beginners, Mr. Gilroy has no equal. No tyro was too weak for Mr. Gilroy to take in hand, and whether he played the 16 or 60 to a hole, Mr. Gilroy's urbanity was unruffled, and naught but words of pleasant counsel and hearty encouragement escaped his lips. I well remember early lessons given to me at Portrush by Mr. Gilroy, and on one occasion, after breaking 3 of my mentor's clubs going to one hole, Mr. Gilroy laughingly remarked, 'I'll bring you a club after lunch that you'll not break.' And sure enough, after lunch, Mr. Gilroy turned up with an old driver of McEwen's with a steel cord shaft. Mr. Gilroy is indeed the father of Irish golf in the truest sense. Con amore, he worked as no paid pioneer ever worked, and his name is known and reverenced upon every Irish green. And many an Irish discussion has been prevented by the simple words, 'Well, Tom Gilroy says so,' rendering further wrangling unnecessary. Immediately upon leaving Ireland, Mr. Gilroy assumed the position of Secretary and Treasurer at Seaford Golf Club in Sussex. Soon afterwards, he was elevated to the position of Captain. Subsequent English censuses from 1901 and 1911 show that Tom was continuing to fund his golfing lifestyle from private means. This would tend to suggest the appointment at Seaford and another one to Chislehurst in 1899 were purely for the love of the game. He based himself in Seaford for the remainder of his life. Another piece from Golf Weekly in 1893 reads as follows: "It is a frequent and pleasant sight to watch Mr. Gilroy, after the heavy part of the day's play is over and dinner disposed of, stroll down to the ladies' course at Portrush on a summer's evening, with his son and his 2 charming little girls to play a family foursome. Good, earnest, philosophic matches they are, and wonderful play too is shown by the youngsters. We heartily wish Mr. Gilroy long continued successes, and when he does, as we all must, drop out of the active militant ranks, we feel sure he will often enjoy the sober but not less perfect pleasure of seeing his children secure many a triumph in the arena where he himself was so often victorious." It is interesting how the written word can sometimes be prophetic, for those young children grew up in and around golf, so it will be no surprise to hear that Randall, Tom's eldest son, would go on to become a scratch golfer. Tom's eldest daughter, Winifred, would go on to win the English Ladies Golfing Championship in 1913, while also serving the Seaford Golf Club membership as ladies' captain. Not to be outdone, Eunice, the youngest of Gilroy's children, would for many years hold the post of Honorary Secretary of the English Ladies' Championship Committee. Tom Gilroy would pass away quietly at his home in Seaford, East Sussex, in July 1923. That he did not bring the game of golf to Ireland originally is of little importance. However, much like his countrymen, George Bailey, John Lumsden, William Pickman and many others, a perpetual medal bearing a name is the very least that we owe these evangelists of early golf in Ireland, who helped nurture and develop the embers of a Scottish gift.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.